Picture this. You're a medieval warrior eyeing Viking territory, thinking it'll be straightforward conquest. After all, these are just raiders from the north, right? Wrong. You're about to learn why the Vikings dominated northern Europe for centuries, and it wasn't just because they were skilled at raiding. They were masters of survival who turned their homeland's challenges into tactical advantages. The Vikings didn't build towering stone castles. Instead, they worked with their harsh Nordic environment in ways that would impress modern military strategists. And it all started with one key insight. When you can't overpower your enemies, you outsmart them. The Vikings looked at their challenging Nordic environment and saw strategic opportunities where others saw only hardships. Those freezing fjords, dense forests, and treacherous coastlines weren't just obstacles to endure, they were natural defenses to exploit. Fjords provided natural defensive advantages that Vikings understood intimately. These narrow, steep-walled waterways limited enemy ship movements and created choke points where local knowledge became crucial. While systematic clifftop archer ambushes weren't common practice, Vikings who knew every rock and current could use these waterways to their advantage during conflicts. The rugged coastline itself became a navigator's nightmare for outsiders. Vikings raised on these waters knew every hidden reef and seasonal hazard. Enemy fleets found themselves struggling with treacherous approaches that local sailors navigated routinely. It was like playing a deadly game on your home field while your opponents stumbled around in the dark. Dense forests provided natural cover that Vikings exploited brilliantly. They would melt into these woods when facing superior numbers, using hunting paths and secret routes known only to locals. These weren't elaborate tunnel networks, but generations of knowledge about moving unseen through familiar terrain. Winter became perhaps their greatest defensive asset. While other armies sought shelter during harsh months, Vikings had lived their entire lives in these conditions. They understood how to move, fight, and survive when invading forces would be struggling just to stay alive. Many potential invasions were abandoned simply because attackers couldn't cope with Nordic winters. The Vikings learned to work with seasonal patterns, timing their movements when weather would favor defenders over invaders. It wasn't supernatural weather control. It was practical knowledge gained from generations of living in harmony with harsh natural cycles. Vikings were far more than simple farmers and fishermen, though agriculture and fishing certainly formed important parts of their economy. They were also sophisticated traders, skilled artisans, bold explorers, and increasingly organized political entities. This complexity gave them defensive advantages that purely agricultural societies might lack. Viking settlements weren't elaborate decoy operations with staged meals and fake smoke. That's more Hollywood than history. But they were often strategically positioned and organized with defense in mind. Settlements typically sat near water for escape routes, on elevated ground when possible, and with clear sight lines to spot approaching threats. The real defensive genius lay in their mobility and adaptability. Vikings could quickly relocate essential people and resources when threats appeared. Their society's semi-nomadic elements meant they weren't tied to fixed locations the way other medieval peoples often were. Local knowledge networks were invaluable. Fishing communities, traders, and farmers all contributed intelligence about strange ships or unusual movements. This wasn't a formal military system, but rather the natural result of close-knit communities who shared information for mutual survival. When direct confrontation seemed disadvantageous, Vikings excelled at what we might call strategic disappearance. They could seemingly vanish into familiar terrain, leaving enemies frustrated and empty-handed. It wasn't magic, it was the result of intimate knowledge of their homeland's geography. When retreat wasn't possible and direct confrontation became unavoidable, Vikings deployed formations that had proven effective through generations of conflict. The shield wall wasn't uniquely Viking. It was used throughout medieval Europe, but Vikings had refined it through constant warfare. A proper shield wall required extensive training and absolute trust between warriors. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a barrier that could withstand cavalry charges and missile attacks. The front rank presented shields forward while those behind provided overhead protection and additional spear points. The psychological impact was genuine and documented. Enemies facing a disciplined shield wall saw an apparently impenetrable barrier of wood, iron, and determined warriors. The rhythmic clash of shields and coordinated war cries created an intimidating spectacle that could break enemy morale before combat even began. Vikings perfected the Svinfylking or boar snout formation, concentrating their best warriors into a wedge shape designed to punch through enemy lines. This wasn't theoretical, it's documented in historical sources and represented sophisticated tactical thinking. Each formation required specific training and coordination that demonstrated Viking military sophistication. The most impressive aspect was their ability to maintain formation discipline while advancing or retreating. Viking warriors could move as a unit, maintaining their defensive integrity even during complex maneuvers. This took years of practice and represented a level of military organization that contradicts simplistic stereotypes about Viking warfare. Berserkers deserve mention, but with important context often missing from popular accounts. These warriors entering trance-like battle states are historically documented by sources like Saxo Grammaticus, but they were relatively rare and often feared even by their own people. Modern scholars continue debating whether Berserker gang was literal psychological transformation, ritualistic behavior, or something else entirely. What's clear is that Berserkers weren't common soldiers, but rather exceptional individuals whose behavior was considered unusual even in Viking society. The strategic use of berserkers was likely limited precisely because they were so rare. When they did appear in battle, their reputation for seemingly supernatural fearlessness could indeed create psychological advantages. But this was exceptional rather than routine military practice. Some accounts suggest that berserkers were as likely to be viewed with suspicion as with admiration. Their unpredictable behavior made them valuable in specific situations, but potentially problematic in organized military campaigns that required discipline and coordination. The mere possibility of encountering berserkers may have been more strategically valuable than their actual battlefield presence. Reputation and fear could be weapons in themselves, deterring conflicts before they began. Viking longships represented genuine technological and tactical superiority that gave them crucial defensive advantages. These shallow draft vessels could navigate waters that larger enemy ships couldn't access, providing Vikings with unmatched mobility in their home waters. The speed and maneuverability advantages were enormous and well documented. Viking ships could reach threatened areas rapidly while enemy fleets struggled with unfamiliar coastlines and challenging navigation. This allowed Vikings to concentrate defensive forces where needed most. Communication systems using fire beacons and mounted messengers, while not a medieval internet, did allow for relatively rapid information sharing across considerable distances. These were practical systems developed for real defensive needs, not sophisticated technological networks. The defensive use of false retreats was a genuine Viking tactic. Ships would appear to flee from superior forces, drawing enemies into shallow waters or narrow channels where Viking maneuverability provided decisive advantages. This required excellent seamanship and intimate knowledge of local waters. These tactics worked because they exploited real geographical advantages combined with superior local knowledge. Vikings weren't performing magic. They were using practical skills developed through generations of seafaring in challenging northern waters. When the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865, beginning a campaign that would continue for years across England, they demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking that extended beyond traditional raiding. This wasn't a single invasion event, but a sustained campaign that evolved over time. The Vikings proved masters of adaptation, adjusting their strategies based on changing circumstances. They showed remarkable ability to coordinate multiple forces while maintaining strategic flexibility. What appeared to enemies as chaotic raiding was often carefully coordinated military action. Their use of psychological warfare was documented and effective. Vikings cultivated their fearsome reputation deliberately, understanding that fear could be more effective than actual violence. They weren't necessarily more savage than other medieval warriors, but they were better at using reputation as a strategic weapon. The art of strategic withdrawal became a Viking specialty. They would abandon positions that seemed important to enemies while secretly consolidating forces for more advantageous engagements. This required discipline and long-term thinking that contradicts stereotypes about Viking impulsiveness. Intelligence gathering and misdirection were genuine Viking strengths. They excelled at spreading confusion about their numbers, intentions, and capabilities while gathering accurate information about their enemies. This was practical military intelligence, not elaborate spy networks. Vikings did sometimes employ scorched earth tactics when facing overwhelming force, though historical evidence suggests this was more about denying resources than systematic environmental destruction. They would drive away livestock and destroy food stores rather than leave them for enemies. The practice of poisoning wells, while mentioned in some accounts, was less documented than the destruction of portable resources. Vikings were more likely to remove or destroy what could be moved and burn what couldn't be taken, rather than engage in systematic environmental warfare. The psychological impact was real and strategic. The message to potential invaders was clear: even if you defeat us militarily, you'll gain little from victory. This reputation for making conquest unprofitable served as a deterrent that prevented many conflicts from beginning. This wasn't just spite or desperation, it was a calculated strategy based on understanding that temporary military defeat didn't have to mean permanent loss if the cost of occupation was made too high for enemies to sustain. The Vikings understood something that many military strategists still study today. Sometimes the best defense is making potential enemies decide that attacking you isn't worth the cost. They built a defensive system based on reputation, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of their homeland. Their defensive strategies weren't about building impregnable fortresses, they were about making the idea of invasion seem like a costly mistake. In a world where communication was slow and rumors powerful, Vikings mastered the art of strategic intimidation. They combined practical military skills with psychological warfare, environmental advantages with tactical flexibility, and individual prowess with group coordination. This wasn't primitive warfare. It was sophisticated strategy adapted to their specific circumstances and capabilities. The Vikings proved that effective defense doesn't always require overwhelming force or massive fortifications. Sometimes it requires understanding your advantages, exploiting your enemy's weaknesses, and making sure that even your defeats cost more than your enemies can afford. And perhaps that's the most instructive lesson from Viking defensive strategy. The best fortress isn't always made of stone. Sometimes it's built from reputation, adaptability, and the determination to make victory too expensive for your enemies to enjoy.